Welcome to the Microsoft Cyber Signals Digital Briefing, where we bring you new threat intelligence insights directly from frontline experts and Microsoft security researchers. I'm Vasuja Kal, and I oversee the Microsoft security business across security, compliance, identity management, and privacy. Today, we'll explore the complex threat landscape across IoT and OT and the risks it poses to businesses as more devices connect to the internet. IDC estimates that there will be 41.6 billion connected IoT devices by 2025, more than double the connected devices in 2020. The growth is astounding. Every one of these devices, when connected to an internal network, to the internet, or to the cloud, becomes an incredibly valuable source of information and insight, often in real time. At the same time, each device is also a potential point of entry for an attacker. In the last 2 years alone, we have seen a 78% increase in high-severity common vulnerabilities and exposures, or CVEs, disclosed by the most common vendors of industrial equipment controllers. This means nearly every organization operating connected critical infrastructure will face the need to secure these environments, whether connecting for the first time or reevaluating the security posture of legacy equipment. I had the opportunity to discuss IoT and OT security with some of the experts who contributed to this quarter's report, and I'm delighted to share those conversations with you today. To start, I wanted to establish a clear understanding of the IoT and OT landscape. So I've invited Derek Naif, Principal Product Manager, and David Arch, Principal Security Research Manager. Derek, it's so great to have you here with me in the studio. Thank you so much for joining me. And David, we are so lucky to have you join us all the way from Israel. So thank you again for being here, and thank you for being defenders. So let's get right into it. Part of the complexity of the IoT ecosystem is a spectrum of different classes of connected or internet-capable devices. When we look at a single line of business within an organization, there may be a vast ecosystem ranging from low-power sensors to business-critical equipment to infrastructure systems like electric grids. We often see a distinction between IoT and OT environments, but within a single organization, that spectrum of connected endpoints isn't always organized or managed so neatly, is it? So we'd love to hear your thoughts on how that's organized, and maybe we can start with you, Derek.
Vasu, that's exactly right. There's a continuum of different types of devices in the organization. So you've got your traditional IT equipment, but then you've got lightweight IoT devices that may be like cameras or things that are in a conference room, like a speakerphone. And that'll go into then things like building control systems. And then on the very far end, you've got industrial control systems, things that run power grids or chemical plants. And among all of those different devices, you've also got a distinction between what we call brownfield devices, which are legacy devices that maybe don't have security built into them, and then greenfield devices, which are newer devices that actually have modern security practices built into them.
And as we look at this, and as we look at from the front lines of security, what are the most significant security challenges to the business when connecting or deploying IoT and OT equipment and devices? And really, how different are these security considerations compared to IT?
Well, let me start with IoT devices. Traditionally, the security built into IoT devices has not been particularly strong. And so one of the challenges, though, is that if let's say you take like a Windows server and you've got an EDR agent on it, you know what's running on that, you know what vulnerabilities there are. If you take like an IP phone, that's actually usually a Linux server that's running on that device that's on your network that's unmanaged and unpatched. And so in some of the work we've done, we can actually look at some of the most latest phones, and you see that it has, say, an OpenSSH server built into it that has unpatched vulnerabilities from 10 years ago. And so it's a challenge for IT to deal with all these new devices that are out there that aren't properly secured. And OT is a more complex beast, right? Because there you're dealing with a lot of legacy systems that may not have been designed to have any security at all. Some of the protocols that are used, the way that these devices talk to each other, are not secure inherently by design. And so it makes it much more complicated to secure both OT and IoT infrastructure.
David, anything to add from your side?
I think that one of the major issues with industrial protocols, for example, um, um, these devices have proprietary protocols. So not only they're inherently are not secure by design, they're also proprietary and cannot be understood by regular IT monitoring devices. Like network monitoring systems are not familiar with OT protocols and don't have visibility into them. And or what's happening when let's say, one device communicates with another device. So there's a need for new security products that can understand these networks and understand the traffic. And also, when it comes to like more, let's say, real-time devices, embedded devices, it's harder to install an agent because it's not a regular Linux system. It's usually the user mode and the kernel mode is all fused in one. And installing an agent for this, it's harder than just installing on a workstation or on a Linux server.
So how do emerging trends or growth patterns help us better understand really the distinctions between IoT and OT ecosystems when it comes to vulnerabilities and security strategies?
In the trend space, we see that there are more vulnerabilities, both for IoT and OT devices. It's growing year over year. And I'm not talking about just small vulnerabilities that are found by mistake. We're talking about remote code execution, which are critical vulnerabilities. That means they can be used by attackers to penetrate networks. They can use by attackers to get implants into OT devices. We see during the years, the last, let's say, 2 or 3 years, attackers are actually doing that. So it's not just science fiction. Attackers using vulnerabilities, getting their implants into OT devices, getting their botnets or malware into IoT devices, and then attacking the IT networks.
Great. Derek, anything to add to David?
One thing I wanted to add was one of the challenges for OT or industrial networks is they have much more constraint when it comes to availability of the device. So in the IT world, we're used to just patch Tuesday and we just patch the systems and up they go. In an industrial environment, you don't necessarily always want to patch because if the patch defeats makes the device go down, then you may actually have your plant go down. You may cause physical damage. And so there's a much more of a higher bar for when devices can get patched or fixed and deploy security fixes. And that actually makes the challenge more complicated when it comes to OT devices because you can't always just apply the latest fix to it. And so you have to figure out other ways to protect it. Let me give you an example. One of the customers I talked to is a power company. And what they told us is they actually had a system where they had to continue running Windows 7 on it because the time it would take them to upgrade that system was so long that it would take them out of compliance with the regulations about how long they had to be allowed to be down. And so as a result, they're forced to continue to run old systems and they have to build tools and tooling to protect that because they're running such an old system.
Yeah, and what Derek, you and David, you just talked about, it's so critical for us to understand because IoT and OT has real human consequence. We've seen that with Colonial Pipeline, we see the critical infrastructure. So it's really, really important for us to make sure we're thinking of a security-first approach when it comes to IoT and OT. So assuming that most organizations have diverse deployments across both IoT and OT environments, do most businesses treat them, or maybe I should ask, should most businesses treat them as distinct ecosystems and establish clear boundaries? Like, what do you think? And maybe, Derek, we can start with you and then go to David.
I think it's a continuum. It really depends on the function of the device and what the risk is. And so businesses that we see will look at these devices and decide what's the risk to my business if this is compromised. So an example of that power company, if it's going to take down the power grid or cause physical damage, there's going to be a much bigger protection around that. They're going to air gap that. They're going to have a lot of protections on that network. Whereas if it's a camera or in a conference room, right, they may not put a lot of protections on it. They may just network segmentation it, and they'll be more likely to update it more regularly.
That's great. David, anything from your side?
I think the trend a few years ago, or let's say even 10 years ago, was mostly air-gapped OT networks. That's how people are building the networks. Today, we're going more for the IT-OT convergence, where these networks are being connected together. It's part of the larger digital transformation. And organizations, sometimes they're not even understanding that they're doing that. They're just doing that naturally because they want to acquire statistics from their OT networks. They want to make sure the OT networks are more efficient and they can, generate more revenue by using things like machine learning in the cloud for statistics they're gathering from the OT networks. So I think the boundary today is already, it's not that of a boundary like we had 10 years ago with air gap, and the world is changing.
So as you think about this, and you talked about these two ecosystems and how do we look at them and how do we connect them, what are some of the common limitations that you are seeing and the blind spots that we should be addressing? And how can really distinct or maybe even converge IoT and OT strategies help mitigate these challenges? Maybe, Derek, we can start with you.
I think the most important thing is for organizations to get an understanding of what these devices are that are on their network. A lot of times when it comes to IoT devices, they don't necessarily know what's been installed and what's out there. And so one of the most important recommendations is to get tooling in your cyber infrastructure that allows you to actually do an asset inventory of what is there. And then the second thing is then to look at those and decide which one of those are critical, which one of those have the biggest risk to my organization, and then try to understand what the potential vulnerabilities are of those devices so you can decide, is this acceptable to be or not? Do I need to patch it? Do I need to isolate it, et cetera?
I love that asset inventory because we think about that as such an important first step. If you do not know where the assets are, if you don't know what you're protecting, if you don't know what the attackers see, it's really hard to secure that. So I think that's a great point. It's interesting when we talk about that we need different, maybe diverse strategies for IT, OT. We also need to take this end-to-end approach when we are looking at our security. You know how passionate we are at Microsoft about this end-to-end security. And it just reminded me that there are also all kinds of attacks out there. They're very diverse attacks. So how should we think about the diversification of attacks? And what is our research telling us about this? Maybe, David, we can start with you on what you're seeing from the front lines of security here.
When we're looking now at the open source community or the research community, there are many open source tools for OT protocols. It's easier to just grab some POC out of the internet and use it to exploit devices. And for example, IoT devices, of course, it's much easier because you just everything out there. Just grab a source code and deploy your new shiny IoT malware. But the entry level from expertise viewpoint in getting to OT attacks has gone much lower.
And maybe I can add something to it and ask a question to you, Derek. So as we think about this diversification of attacks, are there specific types of attacks that are clearly more prevalent with either IoT or OT?
One of the interesting things about the OT attacks is that usually they're coming from the IT world. And so I think what that highlights is the importance of integrating the fusion of the data that we're getting from OT monitoring as well as IT monitoring and combining that into a tool like Microsoft Sentinel so you can get a view of patterns both in the IT and the OT because they're starting to be interrelated when you have an attack.
Are there common vulnerabilities that we see exploited?
It's mostly remote code executions. There are tons of them. That means an attacker can gain complete control over the device, run code on the device from some remote target. And we see there's just tons of malware out there. We're always finding new attackers. It can be either cyber criminals or nation states that want to get inside the networks using these IoT devices because the IoT are like the weakest link and they're exposed to the internet. And when on the other side, when we're looking at OT, because the intention there is more to cause damage and less gain like entrance to a network. So most of the attacks there are, the exploits there are around denial of service or, something that gives them the ability to deploy an implant on the device itself. So that's mainly the distinction.
I think that is it for our insights today. Thank you so much for sharing all those awesome IoT and IT insights. I think it helps our audience understand what they need to look for, how they should protect themselves, what an integrated strategy looks like, the diversification of attacks. I do know this one thing. It's great to have defenders like the two of you. I feel really proud to be in the journey with you. It reminds us of the work that we need to do, and it reminds us of the absolute human consequence that is online if we don't protect our IoT and OT systems. So thank you again for sharing your insights. From the information David and Derek shared, it's clear that it's essential for all connected ecosystems to be designed, evaluated, and operated securely. But for most organizations, IoT and OT ecosystems blend newer devices, which may or may not include advanced security properties, with legacy devices or equipment that may predate even baseline security features or capabilities. It's a fair assumption that security is not always built into connected devices and equipment, and that ripping and replacing devices is simply not an option. In these instances, security strategy and investments must accommodate limited security capabilities at the device level. So I've invited Ken Malcolmson, Executive Security Advisor, to join Derek Naif and me to talk about the ways in which organizations can strengthen their security posture for IoT and OT deployments, and even for whole ecosystems. So Ken, thank you so much for joining us to talk about what organizations can do to prepare for and respond to the threat landscape for IoT and OT ecosystems. How can they really expand their thinking when it comes to security solutions? Like, what should they be thinking about for IoT and OT?
Over the last couple of years, security has become a board-level topic for most organizations, and we can expand that to include IoT and OT. I think it's such a critical part of our organization's defenses these days. We have to have that board-level visibility. And then when we think about developing a strategy, including IoT and OT, the difference is we have to include the right people. So it's not just the information security folks anymore, it's the facilities people, it's your operations staff, it's your traditional IT staff, all those kind of people who are going to be impacted by the decisions we make in terms of IoT and OT security. And as always with the board, we are providing information to the board, and they'll make the decisions on what the strategy is going forward. But that's a good place to start.
Yeah, and I love that you started with the board, because when I talk to board of directors, they are eager to understand how the organizations are securing their posture. And to your point, it's so important, we say the word end-to-end, but end-to-end is not just IT end-to-end. It's OT with that IT. It's IoT with that IT. As we look at this from a future standpoint, what are the areas of investment that we need to look at for IT and OT security?
Brownfield is an interesting challenge. In many cases, it's OT technology that's decades old and cannot be changed for a variety of reasons. So when I think about improving that situation, I start with threat modeling. So we look at the environment as it is just now, understand where our data is flowing to, what devices it's touching, and then understanding what the security state of those devices. Are they healthy devices? Can we prove they're healthy devices? Can we have strongly verifiable identities on those devices? So we're starting to think of a more zero trust model, the strong authentication on identities, strong healthy devices. And then we're looking at the brownfield estate. It's the classic decision. Can we upgrade the solution to a modern platform? If not, can we update it on the existing platform? If not, we're segmenting, we're isolating, and we're monitoring. So that's kind of how we think about the brownfield state. Greenfield is easier, because we then get to make choices on using devices which may have security built into them, unlike the old legacy stuff. Another thing I always think is important, zero trust in an IoT environment is a two-way thing. We want to make sure we're protecting the devices when they're deployed in the field or in plants, wherever they may be, because we're trying to avoid the situation where a device becomes compromised and the attacker pivots into the enterprise. But it's also important to realize we can do zero trust the other way, using strong identity and device controls in the enterprise to stop people compromising legacy environments by having that zero trust conditional access engine in the middle.
I'm a big fan of the zero trust model, so I'm going to come to that. Anything to add, Derek?
Yeah, as Ken was talking about greenfield devices, I think it's important for organizations to think about the procurement process for these types of devices. So just like when they look at their traditional IT systems and software, they've got a bar that they want their suppliers to hit from a security standpoint. We suggest that they need to apply the same thing to all these IoT and OT devices that they're buying that are new. That will put pressure on the market to improve the security and the quality of the devices that they build.
I love the zero trust model, the whole conditional access policy engine at the heart of it, verifying explicitly and starting there, because we know identity is the battleground of security, whether it's IT, OT, IoT, making sure that least privilege access is being used, and then assuming breach is important. I also love what you said, Ken, in taking that zero trust starting from the enterprise into IoT or from IoT into enterprise. And this is why really end-to-end matters so much and comprehensive matters. So as we look at this, it would be great to hear from you both. How is Microsoft doing and what is Microsoft doing to protect against IT and OT attacks?
So I'm going to split that into two sides of the conversation. There's what's Microsoft doing to defend ourselves against those type of attacks, and how are we helping our customers defend themselves against these type of attacks. So we are, Derek, correct me if I'm wrong here, we are heading down the full zero trust model. We already do it for our enterprise environment. We've been on this journey for 7 years. We're not there yet. It's a constant journey. But we have strong access controls in place for identities and devices. And as we deploy new IoT solutions in our various facilities around the world, we can deploy those modern devices that Derek talked about, which have strongly verifiable identities, maybe some hardware-backed root of trust in there, and measuring the device health through monitoring solutions. So we're doing that. In terms of our customers, there's a lot of stuff we have built into our existing security products and solutions, which is becoming IoT aware. So my favorite is our Microsoft Sentinel, our SIEM in the cloud, where we can take signal from things like Defender for IoT, and that gives you a tremendous start. Gives you device inventory, gives you visibility into what's out there, because you may, in a lot of cases, customers I work with don't know what they have. They know they have IT solutions, but they don't know where they are and what state they're in. The other one I would pick on is Microsoft Security Development Lifecycle. So we use this to build secure software. But I have a customer locally here who's using the threat modeling tool within that to build secure devices. They build smart water meters. So those are outside, they're in public spaces, they are an open risk. So they're threat modeling that environment to build a security solution for that. And that's another way we're helping the general customer base.
One of the programs that I'm involved with is called Edge Secure Core. And what that is it's basically Microsoft partnering with our OEM chip provider partners, as well as operating systems and other tooling within Microsoft, to basically allow device builders to have a complete story from chip all the way to cloud to get the zero trust security. And so what we're trying to do as Microsoft is to provide the tooling and all the underlying hardware infrastructure to actually build these types of greenfield devices that enable you to have zero trust on your network.
Fabulous insights, guys. Chip to cloud, shift left with the software development cycle. I feel like, we talk about this every single day, sometimes every single moment at Microsoft, and I'm super proud of the work you do and our teams do. And if you could also touch on the regulations that are coming and how that's shaping the security landscape.
In the United States, the executive order was signed by the administration a year ago about supply chain security. And what we're seeing as a result of that is a lot of work among different agencies to actually standardize on what is required to have in IoT and OT devices. So we see things like CISA, which is our infrastructure security agency, is mandating that companies take vulnerability assessments, or they notify the government if they have a cyber breach within a certain amount of time. And so all of those things are putting pressure into the market to actually address some of these issues from a security standpoint, things like software bill of materials, et cetera. And we see that not only in the United States, but a lot of different countries around the world are adopting similar types of things. And so we at Microsoft are working from a policy standpoint to help basically try to tie those together so that they're consistent across all the different countries, as well as compatible.
I love the partnerships, Derek, that you talked about, and not just here, but everywhere across the world. It is super important. We've said this, security is a team sport. It takes a village. It requires deep partnerships between the private and the public sector. So it's just really great to see that. I also think standardization is important. Consistency is important. So it's great that we now have guidance and that we're working on some standards and we're working on some consistent best practices. Super, super, super grateful that that's happening. Do you have any advice then for security leaders in organizations that are planning new or expanding their current IoT and OT deployments?
Expanding is the harder one of those two. Again, we're going back to understanding what's already in that environment, understanding what can be upgraded to take advantage of our, hopefully, zero trust approach, because I think that's where we have to get to, and segmenting and isolating the things that can't, and then having a monitoring solution on top of that. As we expand those environments, though, we can take advantage of the modern devices that Derek was talking about, and we can apply strong identity controls and device health controls on those. And of course, in a greenfield new build situation, you should be using that by default. Just go through the procurement process that Derek talked about, identify the controls you need, and make sure those are the devices you're deploying.
Yeah, I would add, just as we started this whole discussion, the leaders need to recognize the diversity of all the different types of devices and the different levels of security that they're going to have as they expand out. And that each one of those devices, depending on its use, has different needs as far as how it's protected and how they manage it, as Ken said.
You have used all my favorite words in this conversation, so I just have to say that. Security by default. Like when you design a device, please don't take that for granted. Like design security into it. Make sure we're looking at all our assets, have zero trust at the heart of what we do, end-to-end security, and then ending with diversity. And I will add something more on diversity. The attacks are diverse, the attackers are diverse. This is an asymmetric war. The defenders need to be diverse as well.
Absolutely.
So it's so important for us to include our world as we protect our organizations and our community. So I'm super proud to be a fellow defender with you all. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your insights. I'm super grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Connected devices, processes, and experiences are woven throughout the fabric of our daily lives. We live and work in a connected world, and it's important that we eliminate the underlying risks and vulnerabilities that this new, highly connected world has introduced. The more we confront security limitations and requirements, the better we can understand what is needed and develop solutions that will support, encourage, secure, lasting innovation. Please join us again for the next Cyber Signals digital briefing, and make sure you check out Microsoft Security Insider for the full Cyber Signals report, as well as other helpful information and strategies for securing your organization. Thank you so much again for joining us today and for all you do to make the world a safer place for all.